There really is a South Pole, a barber-style pole with a mirrored ball on top jammed into the snow where all the Earth's lines of longitude meet. Nearby is the Black Dome of the South Pole Station, where the U.S. National Science Foundation conducts experiments. The nearest civilian town is 600 miles away, at Patriot Hills Camp, little more than a seasonal cluster of cloth tents. We were on the bottom of the planet, in the middle of a vast continent nearly 1.5 times the landmass of the United States. In every direction lay the white of the Antarctic, basically one huge glacier, at places, miles deep. In it lie the largest store of fresh water on the planet. It was the 6th of December, 1997, summer there, and the air was a balmy -40 degrees Celsius. Months of planning and days of air travel had led up to this moment. I knew these guys only a week, but we were bound by the extreme nature of our environment, and by the uniqueness of what we are about to do, freefall through the cloudless sky above us and land on the polar ice cap below. Good to go, we climbed into the twin-engine Otter. The lure of bragging rights. I had seen an advertisement a few months earlier in skydiving magazine, Skydive South Pole. I'd been waiting for this opportunity for over 20 years. Antarctica is not a country, nor does any country sponsor the commercial use of the continent. Adventure Network International, the UK-based firm that would take us down, was one of the first companies to set up commercial explorations in Antarctica. This would be its first group skydiving expedition. I sent my resume to Seattle-based Steve Mulholland, the coordinator. I was 39, doing business development for a Silicon Valley computer company, based in Virginia, but I was also a retired Air Force captain with over 16 years military parachuting experience. I had been a jump master in the military with 750 jumps under my belt and wings from 14 countries. I had been civilian jumping since 1976. I was cleared to go, so I hightailed it to the southernmost city in the world, Punta Arenas, Chile, where I would meet up with the other jumpers. There were only 4 of us single jumpers. Steve was a BASE jumper, the acronym for buildings, antenna, span, and earth. They'll jump off anything. He was 36 years old. Long hair, tie-dyed t-shirt, a real sky god, as we call them. Steve's fee had been waived because he coordinated the trip. Ray Miller was from Tiffin, Ohio. He was the owner of Miller Steam, a carpet cleaning company. He also was a successful marketing consultant, real clean cut, and 43. In exchange for Ray's promoting the expedition when he returned, ANI waived his fee also. Hans Rezak, 49, was an Austrian pub owner who called himself retired because he had people he trusted back in Austria running his pubs. He had a military duffel bag covered with patches from all over the world, as if he'd been traveling non-stop. Hans and I, as well as the 2 Norwegians tandem pair, were the only paying customers on the trip, $22,000 a pop, excluding airfare, equipment, food, and hotels. The 4 of us were under the assumption we were the first persons to skydive the South Pole. But while we were waiting in southern Chile, the Norwegians told us we wouldn't be. Sven Borgensen had been the first to solo jump the South Pole, in 1992. A lot of the culture of skydiving is setting records. The Norwegians were going to do a tandem jump, the first over the South Pole. They'd be attached to each other using a single rig. The rest of us looked at one another and said, okay, we'll do a 4-way. It's a fairly simple formation, we'd all done it before, just not with each other. We would be the first 4-way on the South Pole. Our fate was sealed. Chilling out. 4 days later, when the weather permitted, we departed Chile, and flew 6 more hours, landing on the blue ice shelf that is the runway at Patriot Hills, Antarctica. Again, we had to wait for clearance to the pole, so we just hung out and relaxed at this otherworldly locale. Because it was summer, the sunlight was bright all day and all night. We wore our sun goggles constantly. It was -14 degrees Celsius, and just taking a leak was a new experience. Hans and I had taken a hotel room together in Chile, so we shared a tent. He was a pretty idiosyncratic guy. He had a crew cut, tattoos all over his body. And every morning he got up to do 50 push-ups, then smoked his 1 cigarette of the day. At the same time, he was a very cool, bluntly honest guy who'd tell you, "That's really great," or "That's full of shit." Ray, whose wife also skydived, passed around a white silk scarf for everyone to sign. His 2 kids had given it to him for good luck, and he would wear it when he jumped. We learned that Steve had been one of the first people to participate in an authorized base jump off the Seattle Space Needle. He'd also hurled himself off El Capitan, a 3,400-foot precipice in Yosemite National Park, a decidedly illegal move. His girlfriend, Beth, had driven the getaway car. Later, I saw pictures of Hans and his girlfriend, Denise, skydiving naked together. My wife, Mimi, and I had married freefalling in midair, but clothed. The only snag was when the preacher dropped the Bible in freefall. After 3.5 days, we got the okay, so we boarded a tiny twin otter-prop plane to the South Pole. When it comes to equipment, I'm a total Boy Scout. I'm not into the danger of skydiving, I like the feeling of flying. I have all the safety devices in the world. Foremost is my Cypres, a German-made device that automatically opens your reserve chute when you continue to freefall through a certain altitude, around 700 feet above the ground. To my surprise, none of the other guys had one. The South Pole is 9,186 feet above sea level, and we'd be jumping from 8,000 feet above that. That meant we'd be over 17,000 feet above sea level. At that altitude the air is thin, and you fall fast. So, I was using a big, low-performance canopy to slow me down, and land me safely. I also had a special face helmet that won't fog up in extreme cold weather. I know, because I had tested it before the trip by sticking my head in a freezer for several minutes. During the freefall, the wind chill effect would make it minus 130 degrees Celsius, so I was wearing double thermal underwear, both 100 weight and 200 weight fleeces, a Gore-Tex jumpsuit, 2 neck gaiters, and 3 pairs of gloves. We spent an hour and a half at the station unloading equipment, putting on our gear, and checking one another's equipment. There was one last terrible, ironic joke between the other guys about how weird it would be if the Cypres saved my life. On the plane, we passed around a bottle of oxygen. During my career in the military, I had gone through altitude chamber training several times, so I knew what hypoxia, or lack of oxygen, does to the brain. It's like being drunk. A minute seems like an hour. We just passed through 8,000 feet above the ground level. I took the oxygen. At my insistence, Hans took a little bit. Ray and Steve didn't take any. They were busy with the camera that Ray had agreed to wear on his helmet. Should the other guys have been more mindful of the extraordinary conditions? Maybe, but what was I going to do? Mother them. I took it for granted the company had made sure the others were qualified. Besides, in skydiving, you don't question other people's expertise. It's an insult of sorts. Every man is responsible for himself. We were airborne above the bottom of the Earth, the South Pole drop zone. It is the coldest, driest, and highest place on the face of the Earth. We look at each other, thumbs up. Ray said, "Ready." We all chimed in, "Set, go." And we dove together. Too far, too fast. Pure white to the horizon. A hell of a roar. We were falling at 200 miles an hour and had to work fast. Impact from 8,000 feet would be in less than 40 seconds. We had about 18 to 20 seconds to make our formation. By 3,500 feet, we would break off and pull our chutes. Ray was the first out. He exited facing the plane. Hans was second, then myself, then Steve. To catch up to Hans and Ray, I dove, head pointed straight down, arms at my sides. When you're falling head down, you can travel over 220 miles an hour. If others are doing only 150, that difference in speed means you could hit someone at 70 miles an hour, and literally take their head off. So to safely link up, you aim for a space horizontal to them, get relative to their descent speed, then fly in laterally. It's not easy. I dove, checking my altimeter a couple of times, but it was difficult because bringing my wrist up slowed my dive. Then I was lateral, flying in, within 6 to 8 feet of Ray and Hans. Steve was about 10 feet above and behind me and diving down. You see, we pushed it to the limit for one another to set that record. We'd traveled tens of thousands of miles and spent over $25,000 each. Let me put it this way, recently there was a 300-way in Chicago, and one person missed a grip. The whole thing was null and void. Do you think that person took a little shit? I never sensed I was low. There are no roads or buildings to visually use for an indication. It's just pure white in all directions. I checked my altimeter one more time. I could not believe my eyes. We were almost halfway into the red zone, less than 1,500 feet, only seconds to impact. I instantly thought, I'm dead. I did a quick wave, meaning, I'm opening, warning Steve I was going to pull. Hans and Ray's faces were toward me. I didn't see smiles, but you can tell if someone's in a panic they're thrashing about. But these guys were stable, just waiting for me to come in. I went for the reserve, and pulled, but it opened so quickly. Right then I had the weird thought that my Cypres must have kicked in, my reserve opened so fast. But, no time to think about that now, I had to land under my much smaller reserve. I just had time to stow my brakes, make a quarter turn into the brisk wind, and land sideways, wrenching my back, flipping over in a full 360. I had snow all over me. I looked around, thinking, Hans, Ray, Steve, where are you? Where the fuck are you? I couldn't see through my snow-covered visor. I broke my fingernail in half getting my visor up. I frantically looked for parachutes. Far in the distance, towards the South Pole Station, I saw the Norwegians' large tandem parachute and the Twin Otter plane landing. Then, behind me, some 100 yards away, I saw the impressions of my buddies in the ice. They were spread-eagled, still skydiving. This is bad, I thought. No one goes from 180 miles per hour to zero in a second and survives. They were embedded over 3 feet into the surface, which might as well have been rock. I chose not to approach the area. What could I do? Vainly dig into the snow and ice with my bare hands. Go take a look and have a haunting vision the rest of my life. Ironically, months later an editor of a skydiving magazine asked me if they might have been alive, implying that if I had gone over and given them mouth-to-mouth, maybe everything would have been fine. Later, I found that the autopsies showed each of them had experienced severe breaks of the ribs into the body, and basically their hearts had exploded on impact. This guy was implying that if I had gone over and given them mouth-to-mouth, maybe everything would have been fine. I wanted to strangle him. We were a mile from help, and I knew I had to get moving. I gathered my parachute and started walking fast. My hands began to go numb, so I unzipped my pants a bit and stuck them down in my crotch, a technique I'd learned in survival training. 40 minutes into my trek, a snowmobile picked me up. At 9,000 feet above sea level and -40 degrees, it's drier than the Sahara. My tongue was so swollen, I could barely speak. When I got to the station, all I said was, "It's bad. It's bad." I knew from being in a combat environment that when someone dies in a foreign land, your first concern is to get them home to their families. So, I said, just follow my footprints back. Fighting for the bodies. We waited 3 days at Patriot Hills Base Camp for a SAF Air C-130 to transport us back to Chile. While boarding, a snowmobile towed out the 3 body bags, which were loaded onto the plane's ramp, last, so they'd be the first out. I asked the pilot if we could taxi for a while with the ramp down, sort of as a ceremonial goodbye. I stood next to the remains of my friends as we turned toward the runway, the crystal blue sky and the pristine whiteness of the Antarctic landscape visible through the open hatch. I'd been keeping it together for days, doing what needed to be done. But then it hit me. We'd had such a good time, even if it was for only a few days. I let my emotions out and cried for the next few hours. I knew that in the very near future, after I landed in Chile, it was going to be shitty, and it was. There were reporters all over the place. I spent the whole day with the homicide police, then a day with the courts. 3 people get killed and I live. Kind of strange. They wanted to know if I'd packed their parachutes. Every skydiver packs his own chute, I told them. That's part of the skill, the challenge. The authorities wanted to keep the bodies for several months, for investigation. I was screaming at them, I'm not leaving till they do. Finally, the judge said, "I will send these people home. You can go." I got on a commercial plane out of Punta Arenas 3 hours later. Tokens and gestures. I went to the wakes and funerals, all over the country. I also have to travel a lot for work, so whenever I'm near the families, I drop in to visit. When I finally made it to Austria and met Hans' mother, who's about 80 years old and doesn't speak English, she stroked my face for 5 minutes and cried. Hans, brother Karl interpreted. "You're so lucky," she said. "You were the last person that was with my boy." What could I do? I smiled and, held her. But I also told her that Hans and I had really enjoyed our time together. I bought a bunch of little oval pins. If you go to Antarctica, you're given one when you leave. I gave them to Ray's kids, Hans' daughter, and Steve's girlfriend. Now every time I see any of them, they're wearing it. Hans had dedicated his body to science, and the ashes of his remains are in a mass grave. Karl, showing me the site, said he regretted there was no marker for where Hans was. I remembered I had picked up a rock in Antarctica, which I had back in my kit bag. When I gave it to Karl, he gave me this crazy hug and grabbed that rock like it was everything. The bottom line is, so many people die in really sad ways, hit by cars while crossing the road, for example. But these guys died doing something very cool, something they really loved doing. That's what I tell their families, and what I choose to remember. Not their impacting in the snow. Not my having to fight with investigators. The moment that burns in my mind is our skydiving together, Hans and Ray in front of me, Steve right above me, freefalling. We had all traveled so far, and there we were, enjoying that moment, doing what we'd come to do. That's what I choose to remember. End.